How are you? Welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be discussing how many cobs should your maize crop have. Now, I brought myself down to my maize plots that you'll have seen on previous videos for me to discuss this very regular question that comes in any year. Is my maize all right having one cob? Should it have two cobs? But what about if it could have potentially, maybe even six? Now, the idea of your commercial maize crops at home having the potential to be able to produce up to 6 cobs does sound fairly outlandish, doesn't it? No, it's not the 1st of April and this isn't some genetically modified trial. This is commercial varieties regularly grown in the UK. But to show you this, I need to dissect a plant, so I'll be back in a minute. So what I've done is I've selected a plant at random from the commercial crop of KWS Pasco that surrounds this trial site. I've then pared back each leaf on every node below the main cob to see what this plant shows us that it could potentially do. If we take a closer look, we'll start with this first node down here. Can you see there? That's a potential cob bud, so that's number 1. The node above it, cob bud number 2. The node above that, cob node number 3. They're getting bigger. Cob node number 4, getting bigger again. Secondary cob, as we would know it in a commercial crop, as cob number 5. On our main cob as cob number 6. Now, I'm struggling for spare hands here, but I want to show you that this isn't just a leaf bud. And we'll take this third cob bud off, the biggest one of the extra ones that we haven't seen. We'll pull this apart, and there, can you see? An extra cob. So proving that all those buds that we've looked at just there on each node has the potential to be a cob. So as you can see, even in the most commercial crops of maize in the UK, they do have genetically the potential to produce up to 6 cobs in any given year. But still, that question comes every year. Why is it that my maize is putting out 2 cobs? I don't really want it to do 2 cobs. I'd much prefer it to do 1 big cob. What's the rhyme and reason behind that? And what are the implications in terms of forage at the end of the year? Now, the 2 driving factors for whether or not your maize crop will produce 2 cobs in any given year, maybe even more in some cases, up to 3 perhaps, is either environmental or from the variety point of view. But actually the most important one and the biggest driving factor of those 2 is the environmental. So what are those environmental impacts that make a variety or a crop decide to chuck up either 1 cob, 2 cobs, or maybe even 3? Now, when it comes to any species within our forage rotations, I don't think we necessarily always give them enough credit for actually how canny they are. Regardless of how much manipulation we have within their genetics, many of you will have heard me say before, you can't breed the mother nature out of these species. Even from the day it's drilled, as soon as it's emerged, it's already taken into account what environment it is that you've established it into. Not only from a soil type, nutrition, but also from a soil temperature and moisture availability at that given time. So if it is that we've established our maize into possibly slightly colder seedbed temperatures, if it is that then we go into a very dry spring, that crop will already be assessing the fact that it's potentially going to be into a stressful condition for the rest of the year. It will then start deciding whether or not how many cobs of those potential 6 that we've seen on that plant just previously, it takes forward for final grain production for us, but ultimately final seed production for itself and its own species. In amongst all this, the critical stage for these maize crops of ours, making those final decisions as to how they're going to produce, what they're going to perform like for the current season, all happens around about that 6 leaf stage. This, of course, then coincides more often than not with post-herbicide applications. So we have a plant that's making decisions from a reproductive point of view going forward at that stage. We then apply post-emergent herbicides, which some of them may well be designed to attack actually the hormone system of the host plant that you're wanting to clear out. And now you've got a crop that is already making reproductive decisions, possibly influenced even further by herbicide application. On that basis, we're actually potentially influencing whether or not our crops produce more than 1 cob if it is that we're favouring to have only 1 cob on our crops. But we can't get away from the regimes of having to apply post-emergent herbicides to keep them clean so that our crops perform as best as they can. but also there's a varietal element to it as well. The varietal element is really important, and actually the likes of these demos paints that picture in terms of the benefits of certain varieties over others. Now the benefits that are seen are actually the varieties that have been bred for the UK market, or at least a maritime climate throughout Western Europe. Those varieties that haven't been bred in those climates or for those climates tend to have, regardless of what conditions that we put them in, more limits in terms of stress than other varieties. Therefore, you're more likely to have these varieties that do panic early doors. Even if they have gone into warm soil conditions for the UK, it's not necessarily warm soil conditions that they've been bred for. Therefore, their point of stress is a lot lower. So you are more likely to see the likes of double cobbing, for example, on maize crops, if it is that they've not been bred to handle the level of stress that ultimately any UK year can provide them. Now, we've discussed the potential stress points that could mean that any given variety in any given year could feel the need to produce more than one cob for its own survival, almost as a stress reaction in the way that we see grass bolting to head maybe, producing that seed for the survival of its species going forward. But actually there's another side to it as well. If it is that maize is fully confident in the soil temperatures that you've established it into, the moisture it has available, the nutrition that's available to it as well, it will easily produce more than one cob under that basis alone. If it feels as though it has all the resources available to it to produce 2 full cobs, it'll crack on and do that, ultimately giving us more yield and quality at the end of the day. In fact, we can actually utilise the plots that I'm in today. If we have a look at these rows of varieties that are all south facing, they're catching all the light, they're in the most favourable conditions of the field, they are producing easily 2 full formed cobs on the outside of these rows. As soon as we go into the crop, however, you can see that then all changes into single cobs. Just something to bear in mind, that quite often maize crops that are established in good conditions that do produce more than one cob on the outside of the field don't necessarily produce 2 cobs all the way through the field. So it's always worth going that little bit further and potentially just the headlands when it is that we're assessing our maize crops. But I also understand in some years that these secondary cobs can be a bit frustrating. Is it that it's diverting attention away from producing one good cob, almost having 2 half-baked cobs in many cases? But that's not necessarily the case. At a certain point of the year, if maize realises that actually it hasn't got enough around it, or the requirement isn't necessarily there, it will abort those secondary cobs, diverting all its attention into its main cob and still maximising the quality that it may have. So in the grand scheme of things, there's not really a lot that we can do in terms of mitigating whether or not our crops produce 1 big cob or 2 cobs, potentially even up to 3. It's just understanding that if we wanting 1 big true cob, remove all those stress factors that we potentially could throw at maize and you'll stand a much better chance. But there's so many other factors that go into deciding whether or not our crops produce 1 cob or 2 cobs in any year. Another thing to bear in mind is that genetics within maize crops and maize varieties for the UK have changed dramatically, even just in my time within the seed industry. 10 to 15 years ago, we were used to seeing those huge cobs on much later maturing varieties. Now we tend to see a much more refined cob. So it's not necessarily that our cobs are getting any smaller, but actually it's the spindle that's within the middle of the cob. Those older cobs, as I say, 10 to 15 years ago, looked huge, they were huge, but actually it was just from that huge spindle that tended to be in the middle of them. Yes, they looked impressive, but overall feed quality from effectively that strip of wood down the middle really did impact overall quality. Cobs nowadays tend to be a lot more refined, still the same amount of grain, but much smaller spindles on the inside, lifting overall quality of our crops. Pollination of our crops in any given year also is a big driving factor as to whether or not any secondary cobs that may be formed early doors actually go all the way to fruition at the end of the year. Pollination is actually a really intriguing element of maize production, and it always surprises me as to, on maize days that we have farmers meetings, just not as much is always understood about how maize does pollinate, what to look out for, and potentially some of those early signs as to whether or not you could have issues with grain set going forward into season. Now, when it comes to our maize crops pollinating, it's all to do with the symbiotic relationship between the tassels at the top of the plant that produce the pollen and the silks that come out at the top of our cob sites. It's worth mentioning at this point that maize pollen is actually one of the heaviest pollens in the natural kingdom. From any flowering maize tassel, it's only really available for around about 24 hours before it disappears and falls to the ground. This can have issues if it is that we receive either high winds or heavy rain during that pollination period. So if pollination goes to plan, the pollen will be released from the tassel at the top of the plant and make its way down to our cobs, to their silks. These silks act as almost a fallopian tube to each grain site. So the pollen needs to get to these silks. It will travel up the end of each individual silk line to a grain site to pollinate, fertilize that grain site to produce grain at the end of the year. As that happens, those silks will turn this brown colour, almost acting as like a tube of toothpaste as you squeeze it to get the last bits out. That silk will be pushing that grain of pollen all the way down to each grain site to make sure that it gets there. So we know that fertilization and pollination has happened as soon as these silks start turning brown, such as that. We can actually use these plants here to give that demonstration in terms of pollination being an impact or an influence in terms of whether or not secondary cobs actually form. These main cobs at the top have all fully pollinated. You'll see that those silks have gone nice and brown. Those grains of pollen have made their way all the way down to the grain sites on the cob. These secondary cobs though, however, you can see how those silks are still yellow and green. They haven't yet received enough pollen to produce grain on all those sites. Therefore, probably make the decision of actually aborting those cobs and not really going any further forward. If we use these 3 cobs as an example in terms of the different stages of pollination, you'll see that the cob on the left-hand side is yet to receive pollen at all. The cob in the middle has pollinated and those pollen grains are starting to make their way down the silks into the cob. And the cob on the right-hand side here is fully pollinated probably 10 to 12 days ago. Those silks are really shriveled up. It's pushed that grain of pollen all the way down into the cob and is now fully pollinated to produce as much grain as possible for the coming year. We can also use the pollination timings of our varieties to also see how early they are compared to other varieties. If we compare this ultra early in KWS Lato at the top end of our demo plots compared to this candidate variety down at the other end of the plots, you can see there is a vast difference in terms of maturity straight away, probably up to 3 weeks. So if it is we're looking to select earlier varieties, this is telling us already that actually this variety isn't going to be early enough for what we're looking for. If it is that you do have concerns potentially about whether or not your crop has pollinated or not, it's really clear to see on those silks as to whether or not they've turned brown or not. If it is that they're clear and still reaching, still searching, you're probably going to be looking at a pollination issue and a grain set issue within your maize crop. Unfortunately, there's nothing that you can do at that stage, but ultimately it is something to prepare for and can be seen when we do have sporadic weather, especially around pollination for the likes of heavy wind and rain, as I say. So there we have it. A bit of a rundown in terms of why it is that our maize crops can potentially be seen as routinely double cobbing nowadays. Yes, I appreciate it's possibly happening more often than not now, but also I think regarding those environmental impacts that we discussed, they're also having more of a regular effect as well. There is that varietal reason, but also the fact that breeders are asking more from our maize varieties. They're just more productive in the first instance anyway. And also it doesn't necessarily need to be seen as a bad thing from a stress reaction. If it is that these crops do have everything that they need, if you're providing them with all the goodness, the soil temperatures and the moisture required, they will be overly more productive, which turns out to be more than just one cob. If it is that you have enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe and click that little bell. If you have any photographs with maize with 6 cobs on, also share those with me. And I'll see you for the next one. Bye for now.